They still say legends don't begin with glory, but with a warm cup of coffee. There was a man who lived alone in a barren valley. For 15 years he called no one's name, let no one in. Then one day he saw a limping girl collapse beneath his barbed wire fence. What he did next left the whole town hushed, whispering about a morning cup of coffee. Dawn in Dustwood didn't arrive in hues of pink or birdsong. It crept in through the mist that lifted slowly off frost-bitten fields. Overhead the sky lay dull and ashen like cooled fire. The morning wind wasn't harsh, but it had enough bite to make the man's hand tremble as he stirred the stove, though not entirely from cold. Elijah Culver nudged a piece of firewood into the cast-iron stove. He didn't sigh, didn't clear his throat, didn't scratch his head like most men just rising from sleep. Every movement was clipped, sparse, like he feared touching anything that resembled feeling. The silence in that cabin wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that calcified over years, like floorboards too old and dry to creak anymore. He moved to the wooden shelf, opened the tin canister, and spooned 2 scoops of dark coffee into a kettle just beginning to boil. The bubbling sounded faintly like someone breathing beside him, someone long gone from that bed. When the final drop fell, Elijah reached up and took down 2 enamel mugs from the high shelf. One had a chipped handle, the other was whole. He poured into both. His hands were stiff, but steady. Morning light angled through the doorframe, catching the thin wisp of steam rising from the cups. He carried them both out onto the porch. The wind sliced through his collar, sharp as dry paper. Elijah set one cup on the small wooden table between the 2 rocking chairs. The other he kept in his hands. The left chair was empty. Had been for 15 years. No one asked, no one mentioned it, and Elijah never told. He sat in the right chair, holding the mug with both hands, took a sip. Bitter, but familiar. Out in the pasture the cattle hadn't called. No bees had stirred. The sun hadn't yet conquered the cold haze. A gust flapped the curtain behind him, brushing softly against the wood frame. He glanced at the cup beside him. Steam curled from it, faint as a living breath. He had once thought of not brewing a second cup anymore, once thought of putting it away for good, wiping off the dust, treating it like a ritual laid to rest. But that one morning, when he brought out a single cup and placed it on the bare table, a wind kicked up out of nowhere. The left chair groaned like it shifted under an unseen weight. The cup tipped. Coffee spilled, dark as blood, and claimed by no one. The next morning he made 2 again, not because he believed she'd return, just because that chair hadn't broken. And sometimes we keep a habit not out of hope, but because forgetting would feel worse. Elijah lowered his gaze, staring at the dry patch of ground between his boots. The soil there was bleached, lifeless, yet he'd left a few tufts of grass, hadn't pulled them. They grew on their own, uncared for, like certain things in him, rising again despite all he'd buried. He drank another sip, then looked again at the cup beside him. A wild bee had landed on the rim of the chipped mug, dipping its tongue into the warm first drop. Elijah didn't shoo it away, just murmured, soft enough only the porch wind heard, "Yeah, that's fine." And he sat there a good while longer, fingers numbing in the breeze, while the second cup stayed warm, untouched, but not taken. Morning drifted on in the steady rhythm of dust and quiet. Elijah led the gray mule out from the shed, a wooden box of bee traps in one hand, his thick coat damp with early dew. The old beast snorted, stomped once, then followed without sound, as it always did. No reins needed, just like Elijah didn't need anyone to tell him what must be done. The Dustwood Valley sat 6 miles of dirt road from town, far enough that folks forgot exactly where he lived, close enough that those who had passed through still remembered, a silent man and his beehives living among the rocks. Elijah had built his place on the eastern slope, the most barren patch of land around. He didn't pick it for richness, only because no one else wanted it. 4 wooden rooms with rusted tin roofs, low fencing, sheets of metal leaned upright to block the wind, a livestock pen, and a deep, hand-dug well. His bees lived in wooden crates, stacked on stones to keep the damp out. The wild breed he raised didn't take kindly to noise. Neither did he. Elijah wrote no letters, subscribed to no papers, and didn't go to town unless the honey jars were full. Once a month he brought honey to Leona's general store in exchange for salt, lamp oil, and a few packets of coffee. He hadn't eaten meat, not since that day. The chickens out back were for eggs. The vegetables he grew himself, though the earth here was dry as grave dust. Folks in town called him the Quiet One. Not because he was mute, but because he'd never meddled in anyone's affairs. 10 years back, when gunshots rang out at the stage stop, Elijah was the only soul who didn't step outside to see. The way he lived made people uneasy at first, and then made them forget. One time, a new blacksmith asked about Elijah over a drink. An old man simply raised his glass and said, "He lives like no one needs him, and like he don't need anyone knowing he's still alive." No one nodded, but no one disagreed. That afternoon, Elijah sat on the porch steps, shaving termite-bitten wood from the leg of a chair with a small knife. Beside him sat a tin basin filled with freshly washed rags. The wind picked up, carrying dust from the west. Night would be cold. He fetched an armload of firewood from the rear shed, stacked it in the box beside the stove, poured more oil into the lamp. Each action landed on beat, like a song worn smooth by endless repetition. The house had no clock, no calendar. Elijah measured time by how light passed through the morning window and by the crickets chirping at dusk. When autumn came, he hung thicker cloth over the frame. When winter followed, he'd wedge a block of wood at the foot of his bed to hold in warmth. No one saw, and he never needed them to. Those small acts, he didn't do them in case someone came back. Not to keep himself busy either. Elijah did them because if he stopped, he feared whatever he'd kept buried inside would spill out, like floodwater without a dam. He sat at the eating table, wooden bowl, tin spoon, a slice of hard bread dipped in honey, each item worn in just right, more familiar than any word of concern. Through the small window, the hills bowed under the faded hush of sunset. No chimney smoke on any horizon, no barking dogs, no movement, just wind, and a man living like no one was watching, but still placing extra wood on the fire as if someone someday might come in late and cold. In early October, the fog never lifted. It hung all day, silvering the dry grass lining the edge of the homestead. Rain hadn't come, but the ground was damp and slick like the skin of a wild mushroom. The bees moved slower. The livestock pressed into the corners of their pen. No sounds, no appetite. Elijah woke earlier than usual, as if some old instinct within him had stirred, whispering that something was about to shift. He buttoned his coat, slid a small knife into his belt, and walked out toward the hives to replace a few lids. Beneath the old willow tree, the layer of rotted leaves was wet as sludge. An eastern gust caught his hat and sent it tumbling back toward the fence. When he bent down to retrieve it, he froze. A figure, halfway down the tree line where the growth was thick and the grass rose to the waist. Someone was moving, not with purpose, but like something being dragged forward. Slow, stumbling, stopping again, small in frame, tangled hair, one arm wrapped around the stomach, bare feet dragging through the cold mud. Elijah squinted, his hand drifting to the knife at his side, but he didn't draw it. The figure hadn't seen him. She took 3 more steps, then collapsed beside the wooden fence. Her head dropped into the grass. No cry, no call for help, just a body crumpling like a wet sack. He walked toward her, not in haste, but steady. The grass parted under his thick boots. With each step, a question pulsed in his chest. Should I be doing this? As he drew closer, he could see her more clearly, around 20, hair matted with sweat and mist. Her right thigh was scratched and bleeding. One side of her blouse was torn wide, exposing a stretch of skin pale as ash. Her breathing came in ragged rasps, but her eyes stayed open, silent, as if fear had long since worn itself out, or perhaps she'd simply run out of fear to feel. They looked at each other for a moment. Elijah didn't ask who she was. She didn't explain why she was here. He crouched, gently lifting her arm. She was light, but trembled like a bowstring caught in wind. When he slid one arm beneath her back to lift her, she recoiled, flinched by reflex. Elijah paused for a beat, said nothing, and carried on. He hoisted her across his back, stepped over the apiary fence, crossed the bare yard, and climbed the weathered porch. She said nothing, didn't fight, didn't relax either, just rested her head against his shoulder, as if that might be the last solid place left in the world to lean on. When he pushed open the cabin door with his elbow, the warmth from the wood stove rushed out to meet them. Elijah laid her down on the long bench beside the hearth, pulled an old blanket over her body. Then he turned away, stoked the fire, and set a kettle to boil. Only once he stood there in the kitchen, silent, did it strike him. He hadn't done this in a long time. Let someone inside his home, without a single question. He couldn't even remember the last time his hand rested on someone else's shoulder. Outside, the bees had returned to their hives. The sky dimmed further, and for the first time in years, Elijah's cabin held another breath, weak, broken, but undeniably alive. Evening came earlier on days weighed down by thick fog. Elijah fed more wood into the fireplace, the flame casting restless light along the old timber walls, making the small cabin seem like it was breathing. The girl still lay on her side along the long bench, her face half drowned in shadow, showing only the bridge of her nose and dry hair curled like eucalyptus roots. She'd slept the entire afternoon, stirred only once when he set a bowl of porridge near the bed. No name offered, no questions asked. Elijah said nothing either. He placed a glass of water beside it, then turned and walked away. He was used to silence, but this was a different kind. The silence of someone too worn down to guard anything anymore. So she let even her defenses go. When night fully swallowed the valley, Elijah stepped into the storage shed behind the cabin. He rummaged through an old chest and pulled out a pair of soft leather boots, cracked at the heel. They had once belonged to his wife. Inside, still tucked in the lining, was a square of linen embroidered with a wildflower. Elijah stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he set the boots down beside where the girl slept. The next morning he rose early, lit the stove, boiled water, griddled cornbread. Then, as always, he made 2 cups of coffee. Only this time the second cup wasn't set on the porch table. Elijah carried it inside, placed it on the small kitchen table, where sunlight cut through the curtain just enough to warm the wood. That's when the girl stirred. Her eyes were clouded from fever, blinking as if surprised to find herself still breathing. Elijah stood near the counter, scraping honey into jars, not looking her way. But he'd heard the rustle of the blanket, the creak of wood as she shifted. "My name's May," she whispered, voice rough, as if the words weren't meant for anyone else. Just something she needed to say so she wouldn't disappear. Elijah nodded slightly, said nothing. He only pushed the cup of coffee toward the empty chair near the table. May looked at it for a long moment. Then she sat up, slowly, walked over, pulled the chair back. and sat. When her hands trembled from the heat of the cup, Elijah stood, stepped towards the door. But before going out, he turned to look at her, not searching, not pitying, just a full, quiet glance. The way a man might look at the sun returning after a long storm. Outside, the wind still screamed across the fields. But in that kitchen, between two people with nothing left to guard, there was a kind of presence that didn't need naming. You're here. I'm here. And maybe that's enough to be quiet together. 3 days in, May began moving around the cabin. She didn't do much, just wiped down the table, rekindled the fire, washed a few cups. Her motions were hesitant, deliberate, like she feared she might shatter the very air around her. Elijah never told her what to do. May never asked for something to take on. Between them was an unspoken pact. If you can make it through the day, then that's enough. Reasons could stay buried, but Elijah was a man used to reading signs, in the grass, in his bees, in the shifting seasons, and now he'd begun learning to read the way she walked. May always leaned to one side, shifting her weight to the left. When she bent to pick something up, she braced herself slowly, like each movement carried a calculated measure of pain. Climbing the porch steps, she'd furrow her brow, hand steadying her hip, but she never winced out loud. Elijah didn't ask, but he saw. That morning, as the wind turned from the north, he was splitting wood behind the cabin when a soft clatter echoed from inside. He didn't rush, just paused, listening. A spoon hitting the floor, a breath sucked in, sharp and fast, then silence. When he stepped in, May was leaning against the table, eyes shut, fingers gripping the edge of the wood. A spoon lay at her feet. She opened her eyes and caught Elijah's gaze. But she didn't flinch. She simply turned away as if the fall hadn't happened, and resumed wiping the table with an old cloth. A sudden gust swept through the open window, tossing her hair aside. Elijah's eyes narrowed, not from suspicion but from what he saw just below her ear. A bruise, turning color now, circular, could have been rope, could have been a fist. It wasn't from a fall, and it wasn't the first. He said nothing, just walked into the back room, where he kept his jars of salves and foraged herbs. That evening, after May had placed a plate of cornbread on the table and turned to go, Elijah set down beside it a small bowl of warming balm and a clean cloth. No words passed between them. But by the next morning the bowl had been washed, the cloth hung to dry beside the porch. When Elijah went to check on the hives, he noticed something else. The old boots that once belonged to his wife were gone from beside the rear door. In their place, faint prints, smaller, narrower, led out toward the garden. The steps were short, measured as if someone were relearning how to walk. He looked up at the sky. The fog still lingered, but something inside him stirred quietly, knowing there are different kinds of silence. Some are for hiding, some are for bearing pain, and some, like May's, are what it looks like when someone tries to rise again, one step at a time, even when no one promises to catch them. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of smudged ash. Low clouds hung across the western ridge, as if ready to release something that wasn't quite rain. Elijah was mending a honey net when the mule, in the paddock, let out a sharp, uneasy bray, not the kind that begged for food, but a sound clipped with warning. He paused, eyes drifting to where the animal stood, rigid. Far across the valley, just past a thicket of low pine, a figure on horseback emerged, broad-shouldered, rigid. The rider wore a long leather duster that swung to the knees, his hat pulled low. He sat the saddle like a man from the city, leaned forward, loose on the reins, more used to cracking a whip than tilling soil. The hooves beat a steady rhythm across the damp earth, not fast, not slow, a cadence too measured, like punctuation meant to be read. May was watering the garden bed behind the house. The moment she heard the iron hoofsteps, she looked up and froze. The watering can slipped from her grasp, water splashing cold across her bare shins. Elijah saw the color leave her face, not fear, but something deeper, the kind of dread an animal knows when it's once been caught and now smells the trap being set again. He laid the netting down, not hurried, not a word spoken, walked inside the cabin, opened the steel cupboard below the stove, pulled out his old hunting rifle, brushed the dust from its stock, and stood it beside the door. His hand rested on it, not clenched, not shaking, just steady. The gesture was the sort a man makes when he sharpens an axe before winter, not because someone told him to, but because no one else will. The rider didn't come through the gate. He stopped 50 paces out, just beyond the fence, head tilted upward, face hidden beneath the brim, but everything in the man's posture radiated command and contempt, like someone who expected doors to open when he stared hard enough. He waited a while, then turned the horse. No words, no threats, just the dust he left behind, hanging in the air like a question no one dared answer. When May stepped up to the porch, her legs trembled, one hand clutching the door frame like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Elijah glanced at her, only once, not to inspect, not out of pity. Then he stepped out onto the porch and sat. Same wooden chair as always, his coffee half drunk. In the gray dusk, he poured another cup and set it down on the small table between the two chairs. It wasn't meant for anyone, but this time its presence spoke clearly. The wind moved through the porch slats, carrying the scent of horse, wood smoke, and something else that had shifted in the air. Perhaps from this day on, Elijah knew, silence wasn't going to be enough anymore. The next morning came quiet as a dream half remembered. No wind, no sun, not even the bees stirred like they usually did. Elijah brewed his coffee, set the second cup on the table, then stood on the porch for a long time, eyes fixed on the line of trees where the rider had appeared the day before. Inside, May folded the dry towels and stacked them on the wooden rack near the stove. Her movements were steady, but the calm had left her gaze. Since waking, she hadn't stepped onto the porch, like the stretch of yard beyond the door was no longer neutral ground. Elijah didn't turn toward the house. He just stood there, one hand on the chair rail, the faded tails of his shirt fluttering in the highland breeze. Then, after a moment of stillness, he gave a small nod to himself, like a man settling something long weighed in silence. He stepped inside, set the second cup of coffee near the edge of the table, right where the morning light slanted through the wood-paneled door. Maid looked up at the sound of his boots, startled slightly. He stopped in front of the stove, pausing just a beat. Steam curled from the cup in his hand. And then softly, without turning to her, he said, "If you want to leave, I won't stop you." The words came without fence or tether. They didn't bind, didn't beg. They simply placed a piece of honest space between two people, where one could leave without debt and the other wouldn't follow, but also wouldn't shut the door behind them. May didn't move for a long while. She didn't speak, didn't turn to look. But when Elijah stepped out toward the livestock shed, she left the kitchen, not hurried, not trembling. She stepped onto the porch, sat down in the left-hand chair, the one that had sat empty for so long, and stared straight out across the fields. That afternoon, the wind changed again. There was no rain, but the fog rolled in. When Elijah returned, he found May washing old blankets in a tin basin, then stringing them on the line as if it were something she'd always done in a place once called home. The leather boots he'd left beside her bed a week ago were now cleaned, dried, and set neatly by the doorway. Elijah didn't say a word. When he stepped up the porch, May looked up and met his eyes. Neither of them smiled. They didn't need to. That night, Elijah added another log to the fire, and as the wood snapped and popped inside the quiet cabin outside, the cold finally began to arrive for real. By midday, the sun hung weak over dustwood sky, its pale light pushing thinly through fog, glinting on the damp, packed earth near the porch. Elijah was splitting wood beside the corral, the rhythm of his axe mirroring the steady beat of his heart, when he heard hoofbeats. Not the clattering wheels of a trader's wagon, no jangle of harness chains or idle chatter. This was something else, measured, firm, deliberate. Inside the cabin, May was folding fresh-dried towels. She froze when she glanced through the window. Her fingers clenched the cloth so tight, the threads snapped. In her eyes bloomed not mere fear, but a startled terror, like a small creature catching the scent of a trap it once barely escaped. The man dismounted just outside the fence. Eastern deputy's uniform, dust gray, badged in sunlit brass. In Dustwood, where disputes got settled over beer mugs or a sheriff's shrug, that uniform carried a weight foreign to this dry land. He was tall, lean, walked like someone used to making others lower their eyes. 3 knocks on the wood door, each one landing like a hammer meant to test the hinges. Elijah set down the axe, wiped his hands on his pant leg, eyes never leaving the man. The stranger turned. Under the brim of his city-styled hat, his gaze was blade-sharp. "Culver?" Elijah nodded, said nothing. "Deputy Travis Dern, Eastern Division. I'm hunting a runaway, name's May. Brown hair, small frame, slipped out from my district. You seen anything?" His voice was calm, but cold, the kind of tone honed from years of giving orders no one dared ignore. Elijah didn't answer, not right away. His grip lingered on the axe handle. Then briefly he looked toward the door, where May stood hidden behind the curtain, her breath held tight. Travis stepped closer. His boots struck the dirt with practiced weight. His voice dipped lower, almost a whisper. "I know you live alone, Culver. But if you're hiding her, this doesn't end with a question. There's reward money. But the consequences?" He smirked. His eyes drifted to the row of beehives, like he meant to memorize them in case he had to return. Elijah slowly set the axe aside, took a step toward the fence. Not too close, but close enough that Travis had to tilt his chin up to meet his eyes. Then, for the first time in days, Elijah spoke, low, even. "Ain't nobody here but me and the bees. If you're looking for stories, try the saloon. Folks there talk more." Travis narrowed his gaze, fingers brushing the strap of his holster, but he didn't draw. Instead, he spat in the dirt and gave a crooked smile. "Fine, but I'll be back. Don't make me start digging through this place." He swung into the saddle, turned, and rode off, leaving behind a wake of dust and a warning that hadn't fully been said. May stood behind the door, gripping the wood frame, her eyes wide, dry but on the edge of something deeper. Elijah walked into the kitchen without a word, opened the lower cupboard, took out a locked wooden box, and from it, an ivory-handled blade, steel-worn soft with time. He hadn't touched it since the day they buried his father. He cleaned it, laid it in the drawer, then turned toward the window where the rider's shape was fading against the far hills. That night, the cabin was quiet, as always. But out beyond the pasture, a wildcat howled. The east wind tore through the valley harder than before, and Elijah's eyes no longer lingered only on the firelight. They followed the ghost of a rider who wasn't finished yet. The next morning, the sky hung low like a wool blanket stretched over the valley, heavy and pressing. Elijah rose earlier than usual. He didn't light the stove, didn't brew the coffee. He simply pulled on his long coat, laced up the thickest boots he owned, and led his old horse from the stall. The animal snorted as if to ask where he thought he was going this early. Elijah gave no answer. He tied a worn leather satchel to the saddle and quietly slipped 2 things inside. a frayed length of rope, stained with old blood, and a crumpled scrap of paper. The handwriting was May's, written late the night before, brief, clear. As he guided the horse from the yard, May stood beneath the porch awning. She didn't ask where he was headed. She just stood there, coat buttoned up to her throat, holding the cup of coffee he'd brewed the day before. Her eyes followed him, carrying the weight of something she dared not hope for. Elijah paused, met her gaze, and gave a small nod. No promises spoken, but something passed between them that could not be taken back. Town lay 6 miles out, across rust-red hills, skirting the edge of a winding creek. It was a trail Elijah rode once a month to trade honey for salt and coffee. Never this early, never with wind at his back and a purpose this sharp in his chest. Each hoofbeat on the soft earth sounded like a question. Why now? What's he about to say? People in town knew Elijah Culver. They didn't understand him, but they remembered his face, tall, lean, weathered like a fence post, eyes that always looked clean through you without needing words. So when he rode through the square, conversations stopped. When he dismounted in front of the town hall, men held their chew. When he climbed the steps, leather bag slung over his shoulder, they knew. Something wasn't right. The mayor was an older man, silver-haired, once a hunting partner of Elijah's father. He narrowed his eyes as Elijah entered. Culver, Elijah stepped forward, placed the satchel on the desk, unbuckled it, pulled out the folded note and the blood-stained rope, set them both down. Her name's May. She's been staying at my place. The man in uniform yesterday. He tied her up, hurt her. The mayor touched the frayed rope, then looked into Elijah's eyes, and for a breath there was no mayor, no citizen, just 2 older men who'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes you do what's right, even if no one tells you to. Elijah said nothing else, didn't plead, didn't ask for justice. He left the evidence behind, turned and walked out the door as if laying down a piece of memory he no longer wished to carry. On the ride home, the wind picked up, tearing across the hills, and for the first time in many years, Elijah didn't feel the cold, not because he thought things would be all right, but because this time he hadn't stayed silent. Word of Elijah Culver walking into the town hall traveled faster than any rumor that season. In Dustwood, a place where the biggest news most months was who'd traded in a wagon, the fact that the silent man from the valley had shown up with evidence in hand was something no one had seen coming. It started in murmurs whispered over warm beer and dusty counters. Heard Culver spoke up? About the girl? Some say that Eastern deputies got dirt on his hands. Maybe somebody out there needs protecting. By midday, those whispers turned into something else, a quiet gathering. No one called for it, but one by one, folks found a reason to drift toward the square. The blacksmith leaned against the lamppost. Mrs. Leona brought a chair out from the general store. Even the postmaster, who hadn't cared for anything but stamps in 20 years, stepped out from behind his desk and stood on the steps like a man who'd remembered how to feel. And there, in the center of the square, as the sun angled over the old church steeple, Elijah returned. He didn't take a platform, didn't raise a hand, just stood before the smithy holding a folded piece of paper. May's letter, written in small, firm script. He looked around, met eyes he hadn't seen in over a decade. Faces familiar, others changed by time. No accusations, just presence. The wind stirred enough to make the paper tremble in his grip. Elijah breathed in, then spoke, not loud, not forced, but clear. There's a girl staying out at my place. She's being hunted by a man wearing a badge. I don't know all the details, but I know rope burns when I see him, and I know real fear when it's looking back at me. No one shouted, no one surged forward, they just listened. He went on. I ain't good with words, but sometimes if you keep quiet too long, it means you're standing on the wrong side of things. A hush held the square, like the whole town had stopped breathing. Then Leona spoke, voice rough as dry bark. "That man once forced my daughter to hand over the spare key to the boarding room." The blacksmith added, "Saw him grab a girl's wrist at the saloon. She cried. No one dared speak." Then others. Not many, but enough. Voices, plain and low, like wind passing through the years they'd chosen, silence. The mayor stepped out from City Hall. He'd heard it all. He didn't interrupt, didn't deny, just nodded like a man being roused from a long, dull sleep. In the rustle of wind and gathered memory, no one noticed when Elijah left the square. He didn't wait for thanks, didn't need to be told he was right. But from that moment on, Dustwood was no longer the same. By late afternoon, when the sun was no more than a thin gold streak rolling over the hills, the door to the small town jail creaked open. Deputy Travis Dern stepped inside, not as a man enforcing justice, but as one being forced to answer to it. Elijah wasn't there when the mayor and a veteran county lawman questioned him. He'd already gone home. He didn't need to witness the unraveling. He only needed to know May was no longer being hunted. What Travis had once mistaken for authority now hung on him like a weight he could no longer carry. When they laid the frayed rope on the table, still stained with blood, still smelling of wet forest, and when May's letter was read aloud, her slanted handwriting quiet but resolute, he had nothing left to say. The threats he'd whispered, the acts he'd hidden behind a badge, the unannounced visits to her cabin, the words, "If you tell anyone, they'll never find your body." They no longer belonged to shadows. The mayor said little. He didn't need to. He just looked at the townsfolk, the same ones who, only hours before, had begun to speak. Those once silent witnesses who now let the truth spill slowly, evenly, like spring melt finding its way through dry creek beds. And when Officer Mathers, old, worn, and too wise for pretense, clicked the cuffs shut around Travis's wrists, no one clapped, no one cheered. They only stood still, as if holding vigil for a promise that had finally been kept. Elijah rode home beneath a sky glowing amber, the sun casting long shadows across the wild grass near his cabin. He dismounted, unsaddled the horse, scratched behind its ear like always, and walked it back into the stall. The wind was softer now, like something had ceased hiding. Inside, May was at the hearth, sleeves rolled to her elbows, stoking the fire. She heard the door open and stepped from the kitchen, eyes cautious still, but no longer retreating. This time, when Elijah entered, she didn't look away. There were no questions, no stories needed. He unfastened his coat, hung it on the wall peg, and set the empty leather satchel on the table. May glanced at it, and somehow knew the heaviest things inside had already been left behind, back in town. Without a word, she poured a glass of water and placed it before him. He sat quietly, pulling the chair back with care as if to avoid waking the stillness now earned. Outside, the wind had shifted. The fire cracked its slow rhythm in the stove. And in that moment that seemed to hold nothing, May stepped closer, just close enough for firelight to touch her face, revealing eyes that no longer looked like they belonged to someone being chased. That night, Elijah slept without keeping the lamp burning. The cold came earlier than usual that year. Night winds slipped through the wallboards, prompting Elijah to stuff rags into the cracks around the northern window. A soft rain had started before midnight, steady, whispering against the tin roof. It was the kind of sound that used to keep him tense, but now it drummed with a rhythm that felt more like peace. He rose early, not from sleeplessness, but from habit. A habit of making coffee before the sky turned gray. He poured water into the kettle, lit the stove, and reached for 2 clean mugs from the shelf, not chipped, not dusty. May had washed and stacked them the night before, neat as ritual. The water boiled. He poured, his hands steady, like they hadn't been since the first time he'd made coffee after his wife passed. Outside, the fog lay thick over the ground, blurring the line of the fence and beehives beyond. Elijah set the second cup down on the table just as he heard soft footfalls from the hall. May stepped in, hair tied back, eyes still heavy with sleep, but the guardedness was gone. She paused at the threshold, as if making sure her presence didn't unbalance the room's quiet rhythm. The night before, Elijah had seen her standing on the porch, clutching a small bundle, eyes fixed on the road toward town, as if she meant to go, and yet she hadn't. He hadn't said anything. He'd just pushed the second cup of coffee toward the chair across from him. Now she sat, hands trembling slightly as she lifted the mug. The scent of morning, warm and bitter, filled the space between them. She took a sip, then looked at him and murmured, "Stronger than yesterday." Elijah gave a slow nod. No smile. Must have slept deeper. The words hung between them, light as smoke, a truth neither of them needed to name. When the rain eased a little, he stood and poured more water into the kettle, then looked over at her, voice low as the valley around them. "If you need to leave, I still won't stop you. But I made coffee for 2 this morning." May didn't answer. She held her cup with both hands, like trying to keep its warmth from slipping away. Then she rose, walked to the wooden shelf, took down a small jar, the honey she'd strained herself from the hive the day before. She scooped a spoonful, let it fall into Elijah's cup, and slid it gently toward him. No words, just a look. Elijah lifted the mug, took a sip. The sweetness folded into the bitter like a quiet promise, one that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Outside, the wind rolled the fog back from the hillside. The sun hadn't yet risen, but a narrow shaft of light stretched across the doorway. Elijah added another log to the stove. May washed the used mugs. They didn't say anything more, but both of them knew. From this morning forward, each time coffee was made, it would mean something. It would mean, we're still here. We're sharing the sun. A week after the first rain of the season ended, Elijah's homestead settled into a kind of peace he wasn't used to. Not the cold, empty quiet he had long known, but something gentler. A calm made up of small sounds. Water poured into a kettle, footsteps crossing the porch, a wet towel wrung and hung to drip in steady rhythm like a second breath. May never asked to stay. Elijah never told her she could, but every morning the second cup of coffee still waited untouched on the table. And every night he heard her bedroom door close, right after the sighing wind passed through the walls. That morning May brought down an old rug from the attic, coiled so long its edges had stiffened, curled like bark from a dying tree. She carried it to the porch, stretched it out across the clothesline in the new sun, and began to brush it with stiff bristles, layer by layer, slow, steady, no rush to be done. A few feet away, Elijah was replacing a sagging roof beam, one that had wobbled through 2 full rainy seasons. He hadn't asked anyone to fix it since the day his wife died. But today he brought out nails and hammer, lifted the beam, braced it with care. Not because winter was coming, but because it no longer made sense to let it stay broken. Between the tapping of wood and the drag of brush over thick fabric, neither spoke, but the cabin itself seemed to brighten. May laid the rug in front of her bedroom door. She never let muddy boots step on it. Each evening she beat the dust out of it. She swept the corners. She weighted the edges with a flat stone to keep the wind from tugging it loose. Elijah noticed, and for the first time in years he cleared out the room beside hers, a room once used only to store things too worn to matter. He said nothing about it, just oiled the hinges, replaced the rusted lock, cleaned the cloudy window, and placed a small rocking chair beside it. No one entered, but the afternoon light leaned through the sheer curtain each day, as if someone had always sat there. Some changes come without sound, like when Elijah placed both their clothes in a shared laundry basket, like when May set down a second pair of chopsticks at the table, like when he fixed the coat hook by the door and she hung her shawl on it the next morning without hesitation. They didn't ask what it meant, didn't name it, but a place that had been meant for one had quietly begun to make room for two, and the silence between them, once a wall, had softened into something like companionship. Years later, after Dustwood had electric lines running across the hills, after folks from the east came digging at the old quarry, and the town's nameplate had been repainted in clean block letters, people still spoke of Elijah Culver, not because he'd done anything extraordinary. There'd been no gunfights, no high-stakes chase, no bounty ever printed with his name. But on winter nights, when the old saloon glowed golden with oil lamps, the older ones would say, "Remember that year?" The one where the quiet man from the valley came up to towns, carrying nothing but a frayed rope and a folded scrap of paper. And someone would always nod. Someone would add, "Remember how he only said a handful of words, but the whole square felt like someone knocked on the door to your chest?" The story of May was never told in full. Only that she never left the homestead after that winter. She made honey preserves, taught the town children how to shape their letters with care. Once someone asked about her past. She simply shook her head. "Old stories aren't for telling," she said, "just for surviving." Elijah stayed the same, still quiet, still rarely smiled, but every morning he made 2 cups of coffee. As a ritual no one questioned anymore. Only now one of them was always held by another hand. On certain evenings folks might pass the ranch and see the two of them sitting side by side on the porch, saying nothing, watching the mountains change color in the dusk, May knitting, Elijah carving wood, the wind turning the pages of an open book left on the table. Nothing grand, nothing tragic, but anyone who's ever lived alone under a wide, empty sky knows having someone stay when they didn't have to is enough to make a legend. No statue was ever raised for Elijah, but his rocking chair still stood on the porch long after, the wood worn smooth beneath one arm, a long shadow falling across the steps at sunset, like someone was still sitting there, still watching the fields, still waiting on the next morning's coffee. That story about a man who chose silence all his life, then spoke once just to protect something good, is still told in Dustwood, not with praise, not with endings, just quietly passed along so someone might remember that sometimes to change the course of a life, you don't need a gun, you don't need a badge, you just need to set down a cup of coffee at the right time.